The hallway was empty, save for the hum of the ventilation system. Mark stood by the window, the paper firm in his grip. 2 years, 730 days of early arrivals, skipped lunches, and weekends spent refining reports that no one else wanted to touch. He looked at the letter again. The signature at the bottom was ink-pressed and final. It was not just a promotion. It was the physical proof that his pace had finally eclipsed the expectations set for him. He traced the embossed company seal with his thumb. The silence of the corridor felt different now. Stripped of the pressure that had defined his mornings for so long, he took a breath, feeling the paper crinkle slightly against his palm. The objective was clear. He had reached the milestone. Ahead, the office layout opened into the main workspace. He knew exactly where Sarah would be, sitting at her desk, buried in the same cycle of tasks he had just outgrown. He folded the letter, tucked it away, and started walking toward her. Every step down the linoleum floor felt steady, deliberate, and entirely his own. He was ready to share the news. Mark stopped at the edge of her cubicle. He waited for her to look up from the monitor, then laid the letter flat on the edge of her desk. He kept his hand there for a second, a silent invitation to share the moment. Sarah shifted her chair and scanned the page. Her eyes widened, a sharp, involuntary flicker of shock that vanished almost before it registered. She looked at him, then back at the paper. Her face smoothed, the muscles around her mouth tightening into a practiced, flat line of neutrality. "Nice," she said. Her voice dropped, losing its usual warmth, hitting a low, hollow register. She tapped the paper once with her index finger. "They hand those out all the time these days, you know." She did not smile. She did not offer a handshake or a word of congratulations. She simply pushed the document back toward the center of his palm, her movements jerky and precise. Mark stood there, his hand still holding the paper, waiting for the familiar rhythm of their friendship to reassert itself. It did not. The air between them felt suddenly cold, heavy with an unspoken friction that made his pulse jump. He looked at her, searching for the colleague he had known for 2 years, but found only a stranger looking past him at the screen. Mark remained frozen in the aisle, the paper still in his hand. He waited for a laugh, a joke, anything to break the sudden, sharp silence. It never came. Instead, Sarah turned her chair back toward the monitor with a mechanical, jerky motion. Her fingers found the keys instantly. She began to type. It was not the usual steady rhythm of her workday. It was frantic, heavy, and loud. Each keystroke sounded like a strike against metal. Clack, clack, clack. The noise filled the small space between them, acting as a physical barrier. Mark watched her. Her spine was locked, shoulders hunched up toward her ears. She did not glance at him again. She did not pause. The familiar rhythm of their morning coffee breaks, the easy banter about projects and deadlines, had been incinerated in seconds. The air in the workspace felt thin, vibrating with the sharp, rapid-fire sound of her typing. She was building a wall of sound, shutting him out with every key she hit. Mark stepped back, the sound of her frantic work chasing him away from her desk. He stood a few feet off, realizing that the friendship he had relied on for 2 years was not just strained, it was being systematically dismantled by the sound of her own resentment. Later that afternoon, the office hum felt like a low-frequency headache. Mark headed to the break room, seeking a moment of quiet. He pushed the door open just as the low murmur of voices drifted out from near the coffee machine. Sarah was there, leaning in toward a coworker, her head tilted in intense, hushed conversation. As Mark stepped over the threshold, the voices died instantly. The sudden absence of sound was heavier than the talking had been. The coworker glanced at the floor, shifting his weight. Sarah turned toward Mark. Her expression shifted into a smile, but it stopped at her lips. It did not touch her eyes. It was a hollow, rehearsed gesture that served only to mark the distance between them. She did not speak. She did not offer a greeting. She simply straightened, turned on her heel, and walked past him toward the exit. The air in the room felt thin, charged with a static tension that made the hair on his arms stand up. Mark stood alone by the coffee machine. The silence was absolute. pressing in from the corners of the room. He realized then that the exclusion was no longer accidental. It was deliberate, a boundary drawn in the air that he was now expected to respect. The next 7 days felt like walking through a minefield of silence. Mark tried to maintain the pace of his new role, but every attempt to share a brief update was met with a wall of indifference. He would walk to her desk to discuss a report, and she would simply stare at the wall. Her posture remained fixed, a rigid line of defiance that never softened. She did not turn her head. She did not acknowledge his presence with a nod or a glance. She just sat there, frozen in a state of deliberate, pointed exclusion. The air in the office grew dense. It felt thin and charged, humming with a static tension that made every breath feel labored. Mark could feel the weight of her gaze on the back of his neck whenever he turned away. Yet, when he looked back, she was always busy, always looking elsewhere. If he spoke of his new responsibilities, her responses were clipped, limited to a single word or a sharp, brief nod that cut the conversation dead. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, mechanical friction. He was no longer a colleague. He was a source of discomfort. Every interaction was now a sterile exercise in avoidance, a pattern of hostility that turned the shared space into a claustrophobic cage of unspoken resentment. The conference room was quiet, save for the hum of the projector. Mark stood at the head of the table, clicking through the slides that outlined his new strategy. He had spent hours refining the data, ensuring every projection was airtight. He reached the final slide, a summary of the quarterly goals. He opened his mouth to deliver the closing summary, but a sharp sound cut him off. It was a mock inquisitive noise, a sudden intake of breath that pulled every eye in the room away from the screen and toward Sarah. She leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the table. She pointed a finger toward the bottom corner of the projection, her face arranged in a mask of heavy, performative distress. "Wait, Mark," she said, her tone dripping with a concern that felt jagged and thin. "Before you continue, did you really mean to leave that typo on the bottom line? It makes the entire department look sloppy." The room went still. The air grew heavy. Sarah did not look at the slide. She looked directly at their coworkers, inviting them to share in the dismissal of his work. She had not just pointed out a mistake. She had dismantled the momentum of his presentation. Mark held his ground, but the weight of her gaze made the room feel smaller, tighter, and suddenly, profoundly hostile. Mark stood motionless. The typo on the slide was irrelevant, yet the silence in the room stretched, waiting for his reaction. He looked at Sarah. She was watching him, her eyes bright with a sharp, expectant hunger. He noticed the way her hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her posture rigid with a need for his failure. In that instant, the tension in the room snapped into focus. It was not his strategy that was the problem. It was the reflection of her own stagnant career staring back at her from his screen. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the depth of the frustration she refused to confront. She was not attacking his data. She was fighting her own sense of inadequacy. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, but it did not hurt. It liberated him. The anxiety that had been clinging to his chest for days evaporated. Her power over his confidence dissolved. He watched her wait for his defense, for his anger, for his apology. She wanted a mirror to justify her bitterness, but he refused to provide it. He stared back, the static in the air settling into a calm, cold clarity. He was done playing his part in her internal drama. Mark did not blink. He did not offer a rebuttal to the typo, nor did he look toward the coworkers to gauge their reaction. The need for their approval had simply ceased to exist. He pulled his hands from the table and stepped back, creating a deliberate distance between himself and the chair where Sarah sat. Every movement was slow, measured, and entirely his own. He reached up, touched the knot at his throat to ensure it was secure, and smoothed the front of his torso. The gesture was not for the room. It was a physical anchor for his own resolve. He turned his back to the table, ignoring the confused murmurs that began to ripple through the space behind him. He walked toward the heavy glass door of the conference room. His footsteps were even, rhythmic, and heavy against the carpet. He reached the handle, pushed, and stepped out into the hallway. The air here was cool and still. He did not look back. He did not wait for anyone to follow. He walked forward alone, his mind clear, his focus fixed entirely on the path ahead. He was no longer a participant in the friction of the office. He was simply moving. And for the first time in weeks, the weight of the room did not follow him. Mark pulled the heavy door shut, sealing the hallway noise behind him. The conference room was empty, illuminated by the steady hum of overhead lights. He sat at the head of the table and opened his leather folder. The paper felt solid beneath his fingers. He read the agenda items, his eyes scanning the tasks with surgical focus. Outside, he heard the faint, rhythmic clatter of Sarah's keyboard, but he did not turn his head. He did not wonder if she was watching the door. He did not care if his distance was perceived as an insult. For the first time, the silence was not a vacuum that needed filling. It was his own space, reclaimed and protected. He arranged his pens in a straight line. He adjusted his laptop to the center of the desk. When Sarah eventually walked past the glass wall, he did not look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the strategy document, his back straight, his breathing slow and rhythmic. He was no longer a person who apologized for his progress. He was a person who occupied his own life without asking for permission. Every minute that passed without him seeking her validation was a victory. The tension he had carried for weeks finally dissolved, replaced by a quiet, unshakable focus on the work that was his alone to own. Mark stood up, his chair sliding back against the floor with a sharp, final sound. He placed his documents into his bag, the weight of the paper no longer feeling like a burden, but a testament to his own trajectory. He walked toward the exit, his pace steady. As he passed the desks, he did not glance toward the corner where Sarah worked. Her frantic typing continued, a sound that once demanded his attention but now registered as mere background noise. He pushed through the glass doors of the office suite and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, sealing him off from the stale air and the lingering static of unresolved friction. When the ground floor lobby opened, he stepped out into the crisp evening air. The city lights stretched out before him, vast and indifferent to the small dramas he had left behind. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension evaporate from his shoulders. He walked onto the sidewalk, his path clear and his pace unhurried. He was no longer looking for a mirror to validate his worth. He was simply moving, fully aware that his rise was his own, and that the discomfort of others was a boundary he no longer needed to cross. He turned the corner and disappeared into the rhythm of the street, finally free.